Hello, my friends. Dr. Amos here with you again. We continue our discussion on measurement of the price level and its implication when it comes to translating such measurement into the growth terms, as well as distinguishing real versus nominal GDP. So there is a reason why we do this, and this presentation is to discover what this reason is. So what I would like to do is to take the formula for measuring GDP, which is in front of you. This is Y equals price times quantity, and translate that into the nominal terms versus real and in growth terms. So in order for us to successfully move on with that presentation, I want to go back to our notepad here. And basically what I will do, I will introduce some simple mathematical manipulation. So I will say this: when you find that A is equal to B times C, for a small change, you can translate it into the growth terms. Growth rate of A is approximately equals to growth rate of B plus growth rate of C. Because for the small changes, this is going to be very close to exact changes, we'll treat it as exactly the same. So instead of approximate sign, we'll just, for simplicity, do as exact change. All right, so G stands for growth rate. Similar, you can look at if A is equal to B divided by C, you essentially can write it out in growth rate of A, which is equal to growth rate approximately to growth rate of B minus growth rate of C. For small changes, that will hold true, and thus we will, for simplicity's sake, we'll write it as it is exact relationship. Okay, so this is how we translate into the growth terms our simple mathematical expression. Now we can take an example and look at GDP, gross domestic product. Gross domestic product, as you have seen previously, can be written out as output in nominal terms equals to price level times quantity. So this is your nominal GDP that you are looking at. Now, based on the previous rules, we can write this out in growth rate terms. Growth rate of nominal GDP is equal to growth rate of price plus growth rate of output. That is the nominal. Now, you can derive from the top line the real GDP. Real GDP is basically can be written out as nominal divided by the price level. So this is your real GDP, and this is your nominal GDP. Let me explain the difference between the two. But before we talk about the difference, we can write out the growth terms growth rate of real GDP is equal to growth rate of nominal minus growth rate of price level. So this is very cool how it's done, because it's based on our previously derived mathematical manipulation. And let me explain to you a little bit more what it means to have nominal versus real. Nominal GDP is basically calculating the dollar value, as we discussed previously, the dollar value of domestically produced new stuff and final goods and services within the given year. So that's the nominal in terms of the dollar value. Real GDP is basically calculating how much stuff was produced in real terms. You are taking away the impact of the change in price from GDP. And here's why it's important. Let's say you want to compare gross domestic product of the United States with gross domestic product with some country in South America where they run hyperinflation. We can talk about Argentina, for instance. And what you will find that if in the United States you have a very small inflation, but in Argentina you have hyperinflation, then comparing nominal GDPs between the two countries does not, and I repeat, does not make sense. Because you are not comparing apples to apples. What will make sense is to compare real GDP. And what makes even more sense, to look into the growth rate of real GDP. If you want, you can look at growth rate of nominal GDP. But growth rate of nominal GDP would be difficult to compare from country to country. Maybe it's going to be related to time series data, such as historical change in nominal GDP for a particular country. That would make sense. But the real GDP would be a good way to compare different countries. The only one case where nominal GDP is good comparison between two different countries is if they have the same identical rate of change in the price level. Otherwise, it's going to be very misleading. All right, so now we can go back. We understand what the difference between the nominal and the real GDP, and now we can go back and finish our presentation as it relates to the measurement of the price level. So here's your summary. We talked about real GDP versus nominal GDP, the difference, its empirical applications, and we also talked about how to convert this type of statistics in growth rate terms. Now let me talk about how well does GDP do its job. You hear all the time that GDP is a very cool way to compare and contrast the wealth of the nation. And I want to critically evaluate this and whether GDP indeed represents accurately the wealth of the nation. You can Google and find some interesting discussions by Nobel Prize winning economics Joseph Stiglitz. I'm sure you can find some videos on YouTube. But let me talk about welfare of the nation. Welfare of the nation is not solely measured by the dollar production of the wealth. And here's why. It basically comes to the idea that there are many things that make people happy or unhappy for that matter. So just to be fixated on the idea that the amount of cash you have in your pocket is determining your happiness at all times is not going to fly for every rational individual. In fact, research shows that as soon as average American family makes around $60,000 to $70,000 a year, additional money into the budget of the family brings less utility or less satisfaction. It still brings utility and still brings satisfaction, but at a decreasing rate. So what else that is important to consider, and it's not a part of GDP? Number one, inequality. When inequality is taking place in economics, and that means that there are few very wealthy, extremely wealthy individuals, but many poor individuals around, and South American countries would be a good example of that, where there are very few massive landowners and most people don't have ownership of the land in comparison. So when you have a high degree of inequality, it's not satisfying in general for most individuals. And since GDP is there to represent the welfare of a nation, it has this notion of representation of overall happiness and satisfaction, which falls very short if much of GDP is controlled by very few wealthy individuals. So inequality in this regard does not enter GDP as a part of measurement, and thus cannot represent happiness unless it does. The other thing about inequality, when you have a higher degree of inequality in economic market activities, it is fair to hypothesize that few individuals will qualify for the loan, few individuals will qualify for some credit line or line of credit, and that actually is bad for economy. Because when you have lots of individuals that are poor and they cannot engage effectively in economic activities, it's bad for everybody. So I want you to appreciate the fact that inequality is not just about seeing wealthy individuals and not be happy about it, but it's also economically inefficient to have a high degree of inequality. On the other hand, with communism and socialism, it's going to be the opposite extreme, where you have most people receiving a relatively similar compensation regardless of their skill level, and that creates also inefficiencies. And North Korea or former Soviet Union or Belarus, Vietnam, Cuba, hugely underperforming economically, in part because they being pursuing extreme equality, and that also creates inefficiency. All right, so inequality is one thing. The second thing that GDP does not have, besides inequality, it fails to account for underground activity, and often it's referred as a black market. This is when people produce things, maybe producing things at home. You can think about a podcast or some YouTube videos, or cleaning snow in a neighborhood yard and being compensated for that in cash. Anytime when people do any activities that is not taxed or is not recognized officially by the government, that is a part of the underground activity or black market that where GDP fails. Now, some countries, and I have traveled to some of those countries in Eastern Europe and Asia, companies pay their employees in cash that is enveloped and official salary. So official salary is very small, and most people are interested in cash because that's the real compensation. Why they do that? They want to avoid paying taxes. So some countries are exposed to a huge underground activity, a huge black market. Russian Federation would be one example. Much of Eastern Europe would be an example as well, where you will find prime representations of the black market. But black market exists in every country. It's all a matter to what extent it exists. So either way, GDP does not account for that. The other thing that influences people's satisfaction is the environment. We all want to drink clean water. And if you take 200 or 300 years ago and you will say to those people who were alive at that time that in the future you will be selling water in plastic bottles, they would think that you are crazy. Because the water was available, clean water in abundance from the rivers, from the streams, from ponds. And nowadays it's not the case. So, and the same with air. I hope we are not going to get to the point where we will be selling clean air to breathe. But environmental degradation is an issue that certainly impacts the quality of life, introducing a number of chronic diseases, and impacts the life expectancy. And it's not a part of GDP. So GDP fails on that account as well. So, and finally, we talked about income inequality. It's basically based on the idea of distribution, who gets what and how much. And unfortunately, GDP does not have a way to account for that. It is very popular over the last few years to search for other indexes that will account for maybe a level of education as it relates to the population, because the level of education supposedly makes people pursue a higher level of utility or higher level of happiness. And there is an index such as Human Development Index or Index of Happiness, and there are variations of different indexes that are being developed because GDP fails to account so many things. So when you compare GDP from one country to another, you understand that it's far from perfect, and you want to understand what exactly it represents. All right, my friends, and at that point I want to finish this presentation, and thank you for your time. We'll see you soon.